Story number 1, The Devil's Cabin. I had been looking forward to my vacation for months. Work had been grueling, and I desperately needed a break. When I found an Airbnb listing for a charming old cottage nestled deep in the forests of Washington State, it seemed like the perfect retreat. The photos showed a quaint, rustic home with a beautiful garden surrounded by towering trees. The reviews were glowing, with previous guests praising its serenity and charm. I booked it immediately. The drive to the cottage was long and winding, the road narrowing as it meandered through dense woods. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the property. The house looked exactly like the photos, if not a bit more worn. It had an old-world charm, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and flowers blooming in the garden. I retrieved the key from the lockbox and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of aged wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The interior was cozy, though it had an odd layout, with narrow hallways and small rooms that seemed to twist and turn in unexpected directions. The furniture was antique, adding to the house's charm, but also giving it a slightly eerie feeling. I spent the evening settling in, exploring the house, and enjoying the peace and quiet. As night fell, I cooked myself dinner and settled into the living room with a book. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. I told myself it was just the age of the building, but it still made me uneasy. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, far from the rest of the house. As I climbed into bed, I noticed how dark it was outside. The trees blocked out any light from the moon, and the windows were like black mirrors. I tried to shake off the unease and turned off the bedside lamp. I must have been asleep for a few hours when I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I lay still, listening intently. There it was again, a soft, shuffling sound coming from somewhere inside the house. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal outside, or the house settling again. But this time it sounded different. Closer. I got out of bed and quietly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black, but I could hear the faint shuffling coming from downstairs. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the silent house. As I reached the bottom, I saw a light flickering in the living room. The air felt colder, and I could see my breath. I slowly made my way to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The light was coming from an old oil lamp on the mantel, which I was certain I had not lit. The shuffling sound grew louder, coming from the corner of the room. I turned, and my blood ran cold. There, in the corner, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, with long matted hair hanging over its face. Its clothes were tattered, and it looked as though it had been standing there for years. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I needed to get out of the house. I turned and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, but it was as if the door was glued shut. Panic set in, and I looked around for another way out. The kitchen window. I ran to the kitchen, the shuffling sound following me. The window was small, but I could fit through it. I struggled to open it, but it was stuck. With a burst of adrenaline, I smashed it with a nearby chair and climbed out, cutting my hands on the broken glass. I ran into the woods, not daring to look back. The cold night air stung my lungs, and branches scratched at my face and arms as I ran blindly through the trees. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow road, not daring to slow down until I was miles away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I found a motel and checked in, my hands still shaking. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the figure burned into my mind. The next morning, I called the Airbnb host, but there was no answer. I left a frantic message explaining what had happened, but I never heard back. A few weeks later, I received an email from Airbnb. The listing had been removed, and my money was refunded. There was no explanation, no apology, just silence. I tried to put the experience behind me, but I still have nightmares about that night. The figure in the corner, the feeling of being watched. I'll never know what I saw in that house, but I know one thing for sure. I will never use Airbnb again. Story number 2, Staring Back. The drive to the remote Airbnb was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my hectic life. Nestled deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin, the cabin promised tranquility and solitude, the perfect remedy for my frayed nerves. After months of relentless work, the thought of spending a week away from the city's noise and bustle was a dream come true. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The Airbnb was even more charming than the photos. An old, rustic log cabin with a wraparound porch and large windows that offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding trees. As I stepped inside, I felt an immediate sense of comfort. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace, vintage furniture, and a bookshelf filled with old novels. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, curled up with a book, and let the sound of the crackling logs lull me to sleep. The second night, however, was when things took a dark turn. I was in the middle of making dinner when I first noticed it. A fleeting glimpse of movement outside the kitchen window. I dismissed it as a deer or maybe a raccoon, common in these parts. But the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to shake off the unsettling feeling. As I lay in the dark, the quiet of the forest seemed oppressive, every creak of the wooden cabin amplified tenfold. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back door. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I convinced myself it was just an animal, perhaps a raccoon scavenging for food. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the wooden door, too large to be made by any animal in the area. Panic started to creep in. I decided to call the owner, but there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't relish the idea of driving through the forest at night. I told myself I was overreacting. After all, this was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. That evening, as the sun set, the feeling of dread intensified. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. I kept the lights on and tried to distract myself with a movie, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scratching, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. My pulse quickened. Gathering my courage, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. My blood turned to ice. A man stood there, staring directly at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was gaunt, with wild, matted hair and clothes that hung off his thin frame in tatters. He pressed his face closer to the door, and I could hear his ragged breathing. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. My car keys were on the kitchen counter, but the thought of walking past the front door, where the man was standing, paralyzed me with fear. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, followed by another. He was trying to break in. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the lock on the window. It was jammed. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would hold. The banging grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the door splintering under the force of his blows. I had to think fast. The bathroom had a small window, maybe big enough for me to squeeze through. I ran to it and managed to pry it open just as I heard the front door give way. I climbed out of the window and dropped to the ground, ignoring the pain that shot through my ankle. I ran into the woods, not daring to look back. The darkness was disorienting, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching my face and arms. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like hours, I reached a small clearing. I collapsed to the ground, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any sign of pursuit, but the forest was eerily silent. I spent the rest of the night hiding in the woods, too terrified to move. As dawn broke, I made my way back to the cabin, cautiously approaching from the back. The front door was wide open, hanging off its hinges. Inside, the place was a mess, furniture overturned and belongings scattered. I grabbed my car keys and drove to the nearest town, where I finally called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the area, but the man was gone. The officers told me I was lucky to be alive. They'd had reports of a vagrant seen in the area, someone who had been breaking into cabins and stealing food, but they had never been able to catch him. I cut my trip short and returned home. My peaceful retreat turned nightmare. To this day, the image of that man's eyes, staring through the peephole, haunts my dreams. The forest, once a place of solace, now feels like a dark, looming threat. I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, nor the overwhelming relief when I finally escaped. Story number 3, Wendigo Forest. When I decided to book a quiet retreat in the woods through Airbnb, I was looking for solitude and a chance to recharge away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The listing promised a charming cabin, nestled deep in the forest, with no neighbors for miles. It seemed perfect. The photos showed a cozy interior with rustic furnishings, a stone fireplace, and large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding wilderness. After a long drive, I finally arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The isolation was palpable. The nearest town was a good 40-minute drive away, and the road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path winding through dense trees. As I stepped out of my car, I felt a slight chill despite the warm summer evening. I brushed it off, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin was just as picturesque as the photos had promised. I spent the first evening relaxing by the fireplace, reading a book, and enjoying the peace and quiet. It wasn't until later that night that I first noticed something was off. It started with the sounds. Strange, almost human-like cries that echoed through the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or an owl, but the cries grew louder and more distinct, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural about them. I locked the doors and windows, trying to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Sleep did not come easily. I tossed and turned, the cries from the forest growing more persistent and closer. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the early hours of the morning, I awoke to the sound of scratching at the window. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The scratching continued, deliberate and rhythmic. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a branch scraping against the glass. But then I saw it. A shadowy figure stood just outside the window, its eyes reflecting the moonlight in a sickly yellow glow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched posture. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in short, terrified gasps. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The figure outside moved closer, and I could hear its breathing now, ragged and animalistic. I remembered reading about local folklore during my research for the trip. There were stories about a creature known as the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit said to roam the forests, preying on those who ventured too deep into its territory. I had dismissed it as just another campfire tale. But now, face to face with this nightmarish being, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stories were true. Desperate, I backed away from the window, hoping to find some place to hide. The scratching grew more frantic, and I realized with horror that it was trying to get inside. The cabin, which had once seemed so welcoming, now felt like a prison. I darted into the small bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. Minutes felt like hours as I huddled in the darkness, straining to hear any sound. The scratching stopped, but I could hear the floorboards creaking as it moved around the cabin. It was searching for a way in. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. Then a new sound, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard. It was coming from just outside the bathroom door. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I could see the handle turning slowly, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. In a last desperate act, I grabbed a heavy ceramic vase from the sink and positioned myself behind the door. If it came in, I would have one chance. My breath was shallow and rapid, my whole body trembling with fear. The door burst open, and I swung the vase with all my might. There was a sickening thud, and the creature let out a shriek that made my blood run cold. It staggered back, and I took my chance, sprinting past it and out of the bathroom. I didn't stop to look back. I ran through the cabin, out the door, and into the forest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest was a maze of shadows and strange noises. I could still hear the creature's cries in the distance, and I knew I had to keep moving. Dawn broke as I stumbled onto a dirt road. A passing car screeched to a halt, and the driver, seeing my disheveled and terrified state, offered me a ride. I didn't look back as we drove away, the cabin and the horrors of the night receding into the forest. I never returned to that cabin, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. The memory haunts me to this day, a reminder of the dark, unknowable things that lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding.